That attack on Trump was the first such assassination attempt in just over 40 years. But 4 US presidents have been successfully assassinated while in office. In 1865, Abraham Lincoln was the first sitting president to be killed in the nation's history. Lincoln was shot in the back of the head while watching a play just days after the end of the Civil War. A few years later, President James Garfield was shot at a railway station in July 1881. He died 3 months later. In 1901, President William McKinley was shot twice at a musical event in Buffalo, New York. And then, of course, President John F. Kennedy was the most recent leader to be assassinated. He was killed in Dallas in 1963 while traveling in his motorcade. Well, let's bring in Scott Lucas. He's a professor of the US and international politics at University College Dublin. He joins us now from there. Scott, as we've been saying, there have been assassination attempts since JFK, Reagan most recently. When we look back at US history, how have these incidents changed the political landscape, the way that campaigns are run?
Well, in the past, in a much slower era, they do become iconic moments, but they're sort of frozen in time because remember that of all those events that you've talking about, the legends that grow up around them, none of them happened during a political campaign. The last time that a U.S. presidential candidate was shot during a campaign was a man named George Wallace, who was running for the Democratic nomination in 1972. He was shot and paralyzed in a shopping mall in Maryland. So the question here is we're on new ground for, I think, 3 reasons. I think the first is because this shooting happened during a presidential campaign. Secondly, because it's in the 21st century era of social media. And thirdly, most importantly, because the target of political violence is a candidate who has made his political career on the politics of violence. Despite what Donald Trump or someone on his behalf is tweeting today, Trump has made his way by actually encouraging violence against those who are, quote, his enemies. He's advocated violence against hecklers at his rallies. He has called for violence against demonstrators, including Black Lives Matter. He's called for violence against migrants and asylum seekers. He has called for violence against other politicians, and he's called for violence against people in the media and those on the supposed left. So what we have seen is what happens when a candidate who has sort of whipped up division and sometimes whipped up the threats against others, what happens when he's targeted himself? That's the uncharted territory that takes us not only into the election in November, but into, I think, very serious questions about the future of the American political system.
Well, when we see attacks like this, even, for instance, the one on Nancy Pelosi's family, for instance, the storming of the Capitol, you're talking about a changing, heightening level of political violence at the moment in the United States. It's obviously very different compared to previous decades. Where are we at right now moving forward? Are you concerned about what's going to happen after this election, for instance?
Well, absolutely, because, and again, let's break it down with 2 reasons. The first reason is those cases that you cite. In the case of the Capitol attack on January the 6th, 2021, you had a man who was president who was trying to overturn the election, who yelled at his supporters, fight, fight, fight. That same man yesterday, beyond that iconic photograph that you talked about, stood up and pointed at his supporters, put a fist into the air and said, fight, fight, fight. In the case of Nancy Pelosi, that's equally interesting because far from calling for a pullback from political violence, when Nancy Pelosi's husband, Paul Pelosi, suffered a fractured skull from an attacker who wanted to maim or kill his wife, Trump did not condemn that violence. Instead, he actually mocked Nancy and Paul Pelosi, saying, well, she had a wall around her house, but I guess it didn't work too well. So the question is, what type of Trump do we get going forward? One who sees that this celebration of violence is not the way to go forward, or one who has pledged, if I get back to the White House in January 2025, on day 1, I will act like a dictator and I will seek retribution against my supposed enemies.
Scott Lucas there speaking to us from Dublin. Thank you very much, Scott. Well,
make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.